Today, the White House announced new sanctions against members of the Russian elite and their companies.
The European Union embargo on Russian oil exports by sea is coming into force.
Over the weekend, a lot of new sanctions by Europe and the US.
President Putin says the sanctions imposed on Russia represent the biggest current threat to the world economy.
On the morning of February 24th, 2022, the President of the European Commission announced the first of a series of sanctions against Russia. These sanctions, which prevented Russian access to their foreign exchange reserves, targeted Russian banks, businesses, individuals, imports and exports, were described as the harshest package of sanctions that the EU have ever implemented, as they would bring unprecedented isolation to Russia and inevitably cripple their economy. There is no doubt that these sanctions have made their mark, with Russia's GDP decreasing 2.1% in 2022, with sectors like its aviation and manufacturing industries suffering with a lack of access to parts and machinery. Although many industries are yet to still see the full effect of these sanctions, as a whole, Russia's economy is still performing far better than many anticipated. With the US and Canada both banning imports of Russian crude oil, the EU aiming to completely reduce reliance on fossil fuel imports from Russia by 2030, and the introduction of a $60 crude oil price cap by the G7, the West has aimed to reduce Moscow's ability to finance this war by targeting the sector in which Russia relies on for 15% of its GDP. Yet Russia is still exporting nearly as much oil as it did before the war-related sanctions came into place, with the value of these exports increasing to nearly $300 billion in 2022 due to the rise in oil prices. But whilst these export numbers remain unchanged, the movement of goods and Russia's customer base have very much changed within the last 1.5 years, as many are benefiting from their strengthening relationship with Putin's Russia. But just how is this happening, and how are countries using this situation to launder Russian oil back into Europe? If you want to see more content on energy, geopolitics and our world, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to be alerted to future uploads. Russia is a titan in the global energy economy. Of the 100-odd million barrels of oil per day the world needs to function, Russia produces around 10 million of these. Russia also has the 8th largest oil reserves worldwide, of which the majority are located in their west and eastern Siberian regions of the country. The size of this production means that trying to squeeze Russia out of the energy markets was never going to be easy nor realistic. Russia produces several types of crude oil blends, but its major export is the Urals crude oil blend, which has traditionally been priced at a discount to Brent crude oil by $1 or $2. After the initial invasion of Ukraine and consequential sanctions, European demand for Urals oil decreased, leading to its price plummeting to nearly $40 per barrel cheaper than Brent crude oil. Although this spread narrowed over the following months to just over a $20 discount after the introduction of the Russian price cap, the discount increased once again, this time to just over $30 per barrel. Now that the price cap has been in place for several months, the price of Urals crude has settled at just over a $20 discount to Brent. Although much less than the initial discount, this still offers huge opportunity for certain countries.
India has overtaken China as the world's most populous nation. According to the UN, it has some 3 million people more than its neighbour.
India is now the largest population in the world, and with that comes its rapidly growing economy. With India expected to grow its economy by an estimated 6.4% just this year, in order to achieve and sustain this growth, they need access to lots and lots of oil. Approximately 4.5 million barrels per day, in fact. But India is not a big player in oil production when it comes to a country of its size, producing only 607,000 barrels per day, ranking in 25th place worldwide. This is why India is the third largest importer of oil, traditionally relying on countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Their close proximity to the Middle East and easy access through the Arabian Sea means that oil tankers can take around a week to reach the ports of India. But this reliance on oil imports has meant that India's economy is highly sensitive to the price of oil, with estimates stating that a 10% increase in oil prices can lead to India's account deficit increasing by nearly half a percentage point of GDP and nearly a % increased inflation rate. Traditionally, the price of Russian oil has carried a premium in India, as its lighter consistency was easier for Indian refiners to process in contrast with the heavier Middle Eastern crude. But in light of the Ukraine war and the following sanctions, Russian crude oil prices began to fall. So when India was faced with the opportunity of cheap oil from Russia, despite having strong political ties with the West, the choice to import was simple, and not a political decision, but a matter of national interest. The Indian Foreign Minister summarised the situation during a trip to Thailand in August of 2022 as he stated, "Every country will try to get the best deal possible for its citizens to try and cushion the impact of these high energy prices. And that is exactly what we are doing." So since late 2022, Russia has been India's largest supplier of crude oil, accounting for 40% of India's imports at 1.6 million barrels per day as of February this year. Reports claim that India has been buying much of this oil at well below the $60 price cap, as discounts have reached up to $35 when freight fees are not included. Not only is this a great deal for India, but this cheap oil also increases the bargaining leverage that India has when it comes to negotiating with its Middle Eastern oil producers. But although this oil is cheap, there are still logistical challenges that come from importing Russian oil. When it comes to Russian oil, since the invasion of Ukraine, significantly more crude is being exported from Russian ports via tankers. This is the primary medium in which India imports its oil, but the journey is not quick, with tankers taking 3 weeks from Black Sea ports and a month from ports in the Baltic Sea. Shipping costs have also risen significantly, from around $3 before the war to anywhere from $11 to $19 per barrel now. These factors suggest that Russia may actually be selling some barrels at a loss, which would be detrimental to the state's income. But energy analyst Sergei Vakulenko believes that these claims may not be quite what they seem. According to the Ministry of Finance in Russia, during the period from December 15, 2022 to January 14, 2023, the average price per barrel of Urals oil sold by Russia was $46.82. This was at a time where Brent crude oil was selling on the market for $80 per barrel. But according to Sergei, this pricing is not accurate, as the transparency of pricing for Urals oil has been unclear since the sanctions were placed on Russian oil. Another reason for this low pricing is potentially a method to evade the price cap imposed by the G7. If Russian tankers are transporting crude oil that has been sold below the price cap, they are able to gain access to shipping insurance services provided by Western companies. The revenue lost by exporting at lower oil prices could then be made up by increasing shipping costs, thus circumventing the price cap. The high volume of Russian oil exports at prices which, according to some estimates, have been at a 40% discount does not make sense, thus supporting the idea that Russia is not necessarily selling oil as cheap as they claim. Nevertheless, a strong Urals crude oil discount does exist of some sorts, and India has been taking strong advantage of this over the past year, with estimated savings of $3.6 billion to the Indian economy because of this. China is another beneficiary of cheap Russian oil, with Russia now taking the place of China's top oil supplier, overtaking Saudi Arabia. Whilst China produces much more oil domestically than India, they also consume more, requiring a staggering 13 million barrels per day, with this figure only increasing after the lifting of their COVID-0 restrictions. For a country like China, the security and diversification of energy supplies is key. and the opportunity to improve this was presented to them with the Russian sanctions. Transport of oil via the East Siberian oil pipeline, which transports ESPO grade crude, have been stable throughout the past few years and has remained unchanged recently. But changing geopolitical relationships have seen new routes established to transport oil to China. That's why Russia has begun testing the use of a Northern Sea route via the Arctic Circle to get to China's eastern port in Richao. Although this journey requires specialist icebreaking ships, it cuts the time taken to get to China compared to the conventional route via the Suez Canal. Russia has also begun shipping oil to western Myanmar, where it uses a Myanmar-China pipeline to transport oil to China. This route avoids having to travel around Malaysia and through the Malacca Strait, and has been used to transport 3 million barrels of oil since February this year. Russia is also utilizing Chinese supertankers to ship Urals crude to China after the Western price cap limited Russia's access to services and insurance. Interestingly, the eastern grades of crude that have been shipped to China have been trading at less of a discount to the Ural grades to India, potentially supporting the idea that Russia is artificially reducing the headline price of oil shipments via routes where they rely on Western infrastructure. But this pricing discrepancy could be due to a number of other factors. As of March 2023, both China and India accounted for a whopping 91% of Russia's total crude oil exports, a complete shift from this time last year. But use for domestic purposes are not the only reason countries are importing cheap Russian oil. With the exception of certain quantities of crude oil and gas, the EU has largely banned imports from Russia. But money laundering is a profitable business, and so is the same with oil laundering. With the complex nature of oil markets, it's not always possible to tell where shipments of oil have originated from, and this is an opportunity for some. A potential beneficiary of this situation is Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, which sits south of Russia and west of the Caspian Sea, is able to export oil to Turkey via the BTC pipeline, which is then shipped to Europe. But since 2011, Azerbaijan's oil production has been in decline. The country's production averaged 695,000 barrels per day in the first 4 months of 2022, of which roughly 565,000 barrels were exported via the BTC pipeline. But after April of 2022, a strange phenomenon began to occur. Whilst production continued to decrease into the year, exports rose from 565,000 in the first quarter to 885,000 barrels during the spring and summer months of the year, with this figure being far greater than production. Whilst Azerbaijan and BP, who operates the BTC pipeline, both deny transporting Russian oil, others are more suspicious. Another loophole in the web of Russian sanctions is the use of refined petroleum products. Whilst crude Russian oil and gas imports into Europe are limited, no such restriction exists in regards to the import of refined petroleum products. This means that refiners can import cheap Urals crude oil, refine it to make petroleum products like petrol, diesel, kerosene, etc., and sell these at market value in Europe or elsewhere. This is why countries like Turkey have doubled imports of Russian oil compared to early 2022, whilst sales of refined oil products to the EU and US have also significantly increased. But one of the largest players in this sector is India, who may not be a major producer, but is the fourth largest refiner of oil globally. Much of this cheap Urals oil is shipped to refineries in the northwestern state of Gujarat before being made into products where much of it is shipped back to Europe. Before the conflict, Europe imported an average 154,000 barrels of diesel and jet fuel from India per day, but now this figure stands north of 200,000, with a similar increase in many other petroleum products. Refiners in China, the UAE, and Singapore are also taking advantage of buying cheaper oil and selling petroleum products at market value to boost their margins. The geopolitical landscape and sanctions imposed on Russia over the past year have seen a rapidly changing flow of petroleum across the globe. Whilst attempts to strangle Russia's energy sector has resulted in a discount in Russian oil prices, there is no doubt that the situation has been beneficial for other nations. In a multipolar world, sanctions like those the G7 have set have less of an impact when there's always another nation to take the other side of the deal. When it comes to energy security, a nation's dependence comes first above their political relationships. This is why we have seen situations like Japan, a G7 nation, importing Russian oil at prices above the agreed G7 price cap. No doubt further changes to energy flows will occur in the coming months, with new relationships likely to be formed. Thank you for watching Olive Stripe Productions. If you enjoyed this video and want to see future videos on a wide range of topics covering energy, history, geopolitics, and our world, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to be notified of future videos.